All right, we're going to take a look at the last part, or well, the next part of 3.2. So as a reminder, we looked at natural selection. We said the 4 requirements for natural selection to occur are overproduction, competition, variation, and differential reproductive success. So this is just summarizing these things. We're saying that overproduction really contributes to competition. So there are more individuals than can survive, and they have to compete for the resources that exist. And then variation, so genetic variation in characteristics, leads to differential reproductive success. So some individuals will reproduce and spread their genes more within a population than other individuals. And if we put it all together, then competition and reproductive success lead to this process of natural selection, by which species can change over time. So we're going to look at these types of natural selection. So not all forms of natural selection look exactly the same. So it doesn't always look like the peppered moth situation that we saw in class. So first there's directional selection. This means that one extreme is favored over the other. So it could be any type of trait that we're looking at, like the peppered moth. So maybe if the environment changes and the tree surfaces become a lot darker, then the darker the moth, okay, the more camouflage it'll be, in which case the lighter moths are going to be eaten by the birds in the area. So we see this directional selection. So the moths over time will become darker and darker and darker, and those darker coloration genes will become more common within the population overall. Okay, so this is what we refer to as directional selection. So the lighter ones will become less common, and the darker ones will become more and more common. And that's all that this graph is supposed to be showing you. Okay, it's just showing you a transition from, let's say, if at the bottom we're looking at the light color to the darker colors. Okay, a transition from the light to the darker colors, and that's it. This can also happen within bacteria. So H. pylori is actually the type of bacteria that leads to ulcers. So if you have an outbreak of H. pylori that lasts a long time, you would get like a stomach ulcer, and that's extremely painful. But when we look at directional selection, there are some bacteria that are more and more resistant to antibiotics. So let's say you have like an H. pylori infection in your stomach, you take antibiotics to try to kill the bacteria, and some of them survive. Okay, so the ones that have these genes that are allowing them to survive, that's supposed to be our mutant down here. Okay, so it's managing to survive these antibiotics. Okay, it'll be obviously not be killed by the antibiotics, and then it'll reproduce, and we'll have more and more of those antibiotic resistant individuals within the population. And this is why the use of antibiotics is a little scary if it gets out of control. Then we have stabilizing selection. So in stabilizing selection, it pays to be average, okay? So the individuals kind of right in the middle survive the best. So they have the best survival and reproduction. A good example of this would be birth weight. So you can think about this for humans or for other organisms as well. If you have a baby with a very, very, very low birth weight, they're less likely to survive. And having a baby with a really, really, really high birth weight is not healthy either. So that's interesting. So actually being kind of right in the middle is the best. So it's the healthiest way for a baby. So that being the case, we say that more and more individuals will end up having that birth weight. So the ones on the extremes will not tend to survive and reproduce as well within the population. So let's say maybe if they're born and they don't make it to maturity and they don't reproduce themselves. Okay. Then there's diversifying. So this is actually the exact opposite. So there's stabilizing, where it pays to be average. Okay, so being right in the middle is actually perfect. And then there's diversifying or disruptive selection, which is the opposite. So this means the extreme ends are favorable, and being average is actually bad. So that's like the worst situation. So it pays to either be on one side or the other. So those individuals would have the better survival and reproduction. So examples of this could be if we look at these different lizards in the bottom, the anole. So this is favorable to be extremely green or to be this darker brown color, but anything in between is just not favorable. So we see that there becomes this kind of dichotomy within the species. So they're either very, very green or very, very brown. And to be average, okay, to be in the middle is unfavorable. And we can also see these types of extremes with Darwin's finches, and that's, how they became different species over many times. So when we see this over much time, I guess I should say, when we see this kind of separation occurring. So it does make you wonder, like, what will happen to these groups within the future. So maybe nothing, but it's a possibility. So Darwin's finches, I'm sorry, I left all this writing on here. Darwin's finches were believed to have come from one group of birds, one small group of birds, or one type of birds that traveled from South America to the Galapagos Islands. And then they started kind of specializing and differentiating in these different niches where they'd eat different materials. And then I think after a long, long, long period of time, individuals who had a specific beak type to consume certain types of food became favored. So let's say a bird has a really short, strong beak in order to crack some seeds open. So that would be extremely favorable for that type of bird to fit that niche. Well, another bird has an extremely long and skinny beak, which helps it, stick its beak into the sand and pick up insects. That would be favorable for that situation. And they think that after an extremely long period of time, and this is what Darwin thought, that actually because of this type of selection, then these birds developed into many different species. So right now we see that there's 14 species of Galapagos finches, and they believe that they came from a single ancestor. So one type of finch that came to the Galapagos from South America a long, long, long time ago. And so this is just to summarize, okay? So it's saying the directional selection, essentially the colored areas are the ones that are not doing well, and what's left here is what's favorable. So we see this shift, okay, from this side over. Directional selection, remember, doesn't mean that we're always going toward the right. If we're looking at the graph, it could easily be in the other direction as well, just so you know. So if we go back to the story of the moths, if we flip the situation, it could be directional selection in which the dark moths did not survive and then the lighter moths did. And that would be the same type of directional selection. So just another example of it. The stabilizing selection, you'll notice that it's kind of getting narrower if we look at the graph. So we're choosing the average things. And disruptive, remember, the ones in the middle don't do so well. So then we get this kind of dip in the graph, okay, with two peaks on the outer edges. So types of species evolution. So there's convergent evolution, in which two species can become more similar over time. So this is really interesting. But if we think about sharks and dolphins, and if you're out in the sea, a lot of people can't tell exactly what's a shark and what's a dolphin by just looking at the fin. And they have very similar bodily structures, but we know that they're really not the same because a shark is a type of fish and a dolphin's actually a mammal, so it's quite closely related to us. So how the heck did this happen? Well, it just turns out that they took on a very similar niche, and over many thousands of years, then we believe that certain characteristics that came up within the population that were favorable were passed throughout many generations. So if an individual were better able to swim or better able to catch fish, then that organism would survive better than a cousin, let's say, who's less able to do those things. So they became more and more similar over time, just selecting for characteristics that would do well in that situation. Now there's a whole heck of a whole lot of these examples. So if we look, one of the most interesting ones is like the marsupial. So I like the mouse, like a regular mouse, and then a marsupial mouse. So the regular mouse would have live birth. It's a placental mammal, like you and I are placental mammals, and the marsupial animals are the ones that have a pouch. So looks almost exactly like a mouse that you would see. However, it's a slightly different group because there's different groups of mammals. So this is a placental mammal and this is the marsupial one. So this one has a pouch like a kangaroo. So it's like super weird, but they're very, very similar animals. If you just saw a lot of these side by side, you'd think that they were super closely related, but in fact, they're more distantly related than you would think. And the flying squirrel and the flying flanger are an example of that as well. So they look very similar, but they're not exactly the same. And this, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but most people, I believe, call this a sugar glider. And this is the flying squirrel. So that's what most people would call it. All right, so in summary, convergent evolution, or the word convergent just means to come together. So we're looking at two different things and different in origin that are becoming more similar over time. Okay, our next type is divergent evolution. So just like when we talked about the plate tectonics, divergent evolution means that things are moving apart. So if we look at penguins and puffins, so penguins and puffins are both different types of birds, and if we glance at them, they look quite similar, but in fact, they're adapted to very different niches and in very different zones. So penguins are adapted to swim very well. Okay, so they can swim and they can fish very, very well. And puffins are not quite the same. So they fill a different niche and they live where it's a bit warmer. Okay, and they can still fly. So if we look at them, even though they look similar, if you look at the penguin's wings, actually, they almost just look like little flippers. But the puffin actually has more of a bird shape, but it has wings so it can still fly. And that's to do a lot with the selective pressures of what they're eating as well, because they eat different foods. So in fact, if we think back to the same story of Darwin's finches, this is a story of divergent evolution. So going from one group of organisms and then becoming many, many, many species. And this is called adaptive radiation because they were diverging, but not just into two groups, but into many groups. Okay, so we call that adaptive radiation. So just radiating out from one group in many directions, not just two. If we look at this, we have these types of evolutionary trees that just show the relatedness over time. So it's just kind of just showing, we believe that all of these things share these common ancestors at some point in the past, that all life originated from one ancestor, but then just became very different over time. So in summary, this is divergent evolution. So starting from one common ancestor and then breaking apart into two separate groups. Then there's coevolution. So coevolution is when two species change together. So for example, we'll take a wolf and a rabbit. So the faster the rabbits become, okay, we might see that the faster the wolf becomes, because as the rabbits get faster and faster, okay, the faster rabbits will be selected because they're more able to survive and reproduce. However, then if the wolves that are fast are the only ones that can also survive and reproduce, then we'll see that the wolves that are fast enough to catch the rabbits will tend to survive and reproduce as well. So we could have this type of coevolution where they're evolving together. Then there's interesting plant and animal combinations like this. So this bird has this long curved beak, and it's really just to fit this one specialized flower that it consumes. So it's able to stick its long skinny beak in there just to get the nectar from this flower, and it's specialized to do that. And there's a story of the acacia tree and the ants. So the ants actually reside within the acacia tree. Okay, so the acacia tree provides a home for them, and the ants actually help to defend the tree. So if anything tries to consume the tree bark, okay, the ants will be there and they'll attack, and they also actually wander out and will cut down some of the plants that are growing around in the area. All right, super fast summary. So natural selection leads to evolution, which leads to speciation. So we already covered the natural selection issue. So if we have natural selection over many, many generations, this is what we're referring to when we talk about evolution. And evolution can lead to speciation. And speciation is simply the creation of new species over time. So remember, when a population can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring, then they can no longer be considered the same species. So this is speciation. Okay, have a great day.